The first question we have here is, maybe only one person has ever asked this question, but it's a husband who wants to know how he can make his wife enjoy sex. And then you want to take that on, Tish?
Yeah, that is a very common
If you
question.
can answer that question, there's millions and millions of men out there who have their notepad ready and they want to hear kind of the answer to that.
Yes. Well, I do have an answer, but it may not be the one desired. The truth is, you can't make your spouse enjoy sex.
What? Wait a minute. Isn't there like a Karma Sutra or some sort of book that I can buy that will give me the magical formula for how to make my wife always want sex whenever I want sex?
Ah, if sexuality was compartmentalized from our personhood, then maybe that would be possible to have a magic formula or a wand out there that
Tish, you're shattering everything I ever learned in the locker room about sex. And what are you saying here?
I'm so sorry. The locker room has lied to you. Um, I know, but my heart goes out to, to the spouse on both sides of this, right? It is painful to be the spouse that is desiring connection,
Mm.
desiring to be physically close and to be reaching out for that, and then to have, um, you know, this, your spouse declining that or saying no, or there's a feeling of it not being interested, them not being interested. And that can feel like really powerful rejection. That can be
Yeah.
painful, hard to understand that. And
Gosh,
so,
can we rabbit trail for a second there? And there's so much here to unpack. Seriously, this is a question that we get all the time in counseling, and it's one that I think probably every couple at one point or another has desire differences. Right? Our statistics would say that something around 80% of couples, the husband desires a higher level of frequency than their wives. And 20% of couples, wives have a higher desire for frequency than their husbands. And if you do your math there, and I'm a counselor, not a mathematician, counselors are notoriously terrible with math, but I think that adds up to 100% of couples have different desires. Like virtually no couple has exactly the same level of desire. And even if they have the exact level in terms of desire for frequency, the timing of that aligning so that their desire is at the same time always is zero.
yeah.
That's no couples out there. So every couple has to navigate kind of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to take just a moment on the front end of that question to go deeper with what you just said. I think sometimes the men's sexual desire can be kind of demonized in some ways. Can be seen as that all men are interested in sex, and that for them to want sexual connection, is kind of like a lame roll the eyes, and of course you do, you're a man when you're not thinking about sex. And it's not really viewed as a bid for connection. It's not really viewed as an attachment thing. It's kind of seen as this shallow kind of aspect of men. And I'd just be curious to hear you just speak to that from a woman to the wives that are out there, as someone that does sex therapy, works with couples, kind of navigating these difficulties, maybe help the wives out there have a framework for maybe understanding their husband's sexual experience.
Yeah, I think I would want to start with being able to talk about God's design for masculine sexuality and for sexuality in general. That sexuality and connecting sexually is a powerful bonding experience, and it's a bonding experience emotionally, mentally, obviously physically, kind of in the sense that we think of the physicality of sex, but there's a physiological component of literally how God designed our biology to respond and to release chemicals in our bloodstream that's helping us feel bonded with our spouse. And that for men, they actually experience what we would call like the bonding. It's a lot of times called like the bonding hormone, oxytocin, that they experience that something 400 to 600 times the amount in their bodies as women do. Women experience that in large amounts when they are, after they have a baby, and when their milk lets down and they're bonding with their infant. Women experience high levels of oxytocin, and couples experience oxytocin when they hug and when they're face to face and eye to eye. But whenever there is kind of sexual release and activity with the one you're bonded with, the body has this response in masculine sexuality where it actually releases this bonding chemical in the droves in your man's body. And so it feels literally, they feel so emotionally close to you that it isn't they're just in it for, and certainly there's a lot of instances where sexuality is chopped off from the better whole of the relationship, and it's abused or not understood the purpose. But I think our conversation, it's so helpful to start with God's good design in masculine sexuality, how he designed the body to support his plan of sexuality being an expression of desire and a part in the relationship, a relational activity that actually brings such a felt sense of bond. And so, so I think for the women, I would just want to say that that their husband is experiencing a desire to be close to them, and that sexuality and sexual activity and intimacy in the relationship is experienced differently in their body. Emotionally, there's something very unique about a man's body in that way.
I think I hear you saying that is by design. Right?
God did that on purpose. Yes.
That's not like something that men thought up and kind of like created themselves to be.
No, right. Right. Men were not like, this is really fun, I'm going to make it where I have lots of high doses of chemicals, bonding chemicals in my body when this happens. That's something that God did on purpose, and it's really beautiful if you think about how beautiful that is.
There's a piece in there that I want to come back to, and just having a conversation with the men, really answering this question some more, because one of the things that Tish just said, that if you're a man out there and you have this same question, I really want you to kind of write down and focus on and pay attention to, because we're talking about this kind of bonding hormone of oxytocin and the role that it plays in a sexual relationship. And it's really important to understand some of the science around this, the biology around it, because in new relationships, in the early phases of relationships, the hormones that tend to drive sexual encounters and sexual relationships are adrenaline and dopamine. That it's a real, it's a intense high in sexual connection, and that characterizes that early part of a relationship where we're flirtatious, we're horny, or it's new and it's exciting, and this adrenaline and dopamine kind of drives and is the primary hormonal experience that's a part of the connection time. But as a relationship normalizes, as it stabilizes, the hormone that really moderates and drives the sexual relationship is oxytocin. So it's a shift that happens within the body in all relationships as they move out of those early stages into stable kinds of relationships, bonded, attached, connected, stable relationships, right? And this is really important, not only for the gals out there, like Tish was saying, and understanding how men's bodies operate, how they bond through those sexual experiences with their wives, but there's this really important piece for the men out there that Tish mentioned. And she, if you were paying attention, she said for your wives, for a female's body, that it's not just connecting sexually that creates an oxytocin release, but that there's really these other kinds of activities that are bonding and connective and relational kinds of activities. The non-sexual physical touch that we have in a relationship, the heartfelt emotional conversations and connection. It's an incredible oxytocin release when a woman sees her husband playing with their kids and that, like that action. And that is a sexual hormone that is being evoked by her body from these activities. And that plays a really important role in setting the context for a woman being interested in connecting sexually. And maybe you could just talk to that a little bit more, Tish, and helping the men out there understand how that reality of a woman's body's response to these relational activities that are maybe in a man's mind not sexual in nature, right? Men, those aren't the things that are turn-ons or accelerators or drivers for a man. And so we can be at a bit of a loss, in figuring out the mystery of womanhood. Can you unshroud the mystery kind of for us?
Let me just clear up all the mystery around femininity. No problem. Yeah, I mean, it can feel really mystifying. And I think it's really beautiful how God designed feminine sexuality and masculine sexuality to complement each other. And for women, they need to feel bonded. They need oxytocin in their body to be able to desire sexual connection.
Wait a minute, slow down here. As what I'm hearing is that, I heard you describe male sexuality, right? And man orgasming with his bride and all this oxytocin release in his body and this kind of bonding experience on the tail end of a sexual encounter kind of with his spouse, with his wife. But what I hear you saying now is that for his wife, that there's a need for kind of that oxytocin experience on the front end to lead into it. Is that what we're saying here?
Yes, I mean, think about it. It's oxytocin helps us feel warm and connected. There's like an open-heartedness. It's you feel generous. You want to give. You want to receive. And men, sexual connection actually fills their body with oxytocin and is going to motivate them to warmer, more generous relational activities that are non-sexual. For women, the non-sexual activities such as conversation, feeling known and feeling like you're understood and that you're understanding, and there's a mental
man at the kitchen sink doing dishes.
Yes, and all of those things of feeling connected in like the bigger landscape of life, that is going to contribute to a woman's sense of connectedness, which then God designed her body then to desire to be given sexually when there's that emotional, mental connection with her spouse, the relational connection. And so, I mean, they complement each other perfectly.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like we could get a spiral of sorts going, not a downward spiral, but spirals can actually go in the opposite direction as well. Is that, do you see that in your practice with couples as they start to understand the differences between each other and how those differences can complement each other?
Yes, absolutely. And it's really exciting to see a couple, because think about the downward spiral that happens. You know, a man desiring to be close to his wife, wants to be connected with her. And so God created him to desire sexual connection. So he reaches out for sexual connection, and the wife doesn't feel relationally connected. And so she declines, and then he feels rejected, and he doesn't feel relationally connected. So he withdraws, or he's hurt, and that comes out maybe sideways, passive aggressive ways, or he's distant, which then keeps his wife from feeling relationally connected, which then causes her to not desire sexual connection, which then causes the husband to feel connected. Right? It's like this vicious cycle. And it saddens me when I sit with couples, Josh. It saddens me because they both are desiring the same thing.
Yes.
They want,
Yes.
they are desiring what God designed them, this healthy need to be connected with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so of being able to understand that and then be able to turn towards each other, then we can create, the upward spiral, the spiral that's creating connection, that is creating relational connection, momentum, if you will, and relational connection that incorporate, right? Because if incorporates the whole person, we aren't just sexual beings, and that is a misuse of God's design when sexuality is chopped off and tried to be used without the mind and the emotions and relationship. And so in the same way, sexuality has meant to be a beautiful part of relational connection in marriage. And so God created feminine and masculine sexuality to be these two, what can feel like opposing forces. They actually aren't. They work
Right.
together beautifully.
Yeah, and man, isn't it? It's heartbreaking for me when I have couples come in and they're in this place of really longing for the same thing, but really feeling disconnected, and how they're going about trying to have those needs met. It's really sabotaging themselves, shooting themselves in the foot. You know, that they are. It's just heartbreaking, and so often it's happening totally unintentionally. You know that we. It's the confusion that the enemy uses to create disconnection within relationship. And sometimes I think, are not understanding and not appreciating the differences between each other really results in us sending a message that if we were married to someone that shared our gender, would maybe be received very positively, but because we're married to somebody different ourselves, is not received so positively. Like I think about men all the time. You know, if a wife were to walk down passing her husband in the hall and grab a hold of his genitals and give him a gentle squeeze and be like, "Yeah, that's what I want,"
Yes.
and be like, "Is it my birthday? Like what?" What a heaven, the affirmation of being wanted and being pursued and found sexually desirable and kind of, yeah. But when a man kind of like walks into the kitchen and honks his wife's breast, do you the same way as
No.
no, that's not a turn on for you? That's not
And that has not been the general consensus of my clients either.
right. I think one in one women will kind of like agree with that piece that
Right.
that's not something that they would experience positively, that's not the design. They're not a man, and that's okay. They're not supposed to experience those things in the same way. And I've heard and seen very similar kinds of things happen come in the other direction. Like sometimes wives will say in the most kind of cherishing and loving way, like, you know what? I love you so much, husband of mine. You're such a great father and such a great husband that, man, if we never had sex again, I could be okay with that. Like I don't even need that as part of our relationship. That I just so enjoy you and being married to you and our closeness and connection and doing life together and our camaraderie and our friendship. Like it would be, perfectly okay with me if we never had sex again. Which for a man kind of feels a lot like maybe a woman might experience it if the husband was like, baby, you're so attractive and you're so hot that, if we never had another meaningful conversation the rest of our married life together, but we could just keep having great sex, I'd be okay with that. Like I don't even ever need to hear your voice again. That would be okay with me. And, as long as we could keep having wonderful sex together, then like, oh,
Yeah.
right? There's just kind of this crushing peace, where we can be so invalidating, and without even really realizing it. You
It's
know,
so it's so true, Josh. And I think that, and we are generalizing, so I do want to remind anyone who's watching that this can be flip-flopped.
totally.
And so but we're speaking to make, kind of speaking easier. We are going with a generality here, but for women, sexuality tends to be, they it's more integrated into their whole personhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's so many things that impact a woman's sexual desire. And we've been talking about that a little bit. And a lot can contribute to experiencing sexuality negatively. Not understanding your own sexuality can create all kinds of situations that a woman or a wife is in, that sexuality has become very paired with negative emotion. And for men, there can be, kind of in the same way, situations and experiences in life that has created a connection with their sexuality that is very compartmentalized from their whole personhood, and where it makes, some obstacles of to overcome, where, a man can really feel that way of like, maybe not as extreme, not like what you're saying, but like if we just had sex and all of our problems would be fixed.
Right,
That's
totally.
the only problem in our relationship.
Yeah, because there's this aspect of men's personhood kind of very much being integrated with their sexuality, right?
Mhm.
In a way that for women, their sense of personhood can be kind of disintegrated in some ways. And here's what I mean by that it is, I've never ever had a man sit on my couch and say, Josh, I'm just like a big walking penis to my wife. Like, she doesn't even care about me as a person and who I am. It's just sex, sex, sex. All she's interested in is my penis and my body. And I just am really distraught about that. Like maybe that guy exists out there. I just, in 10 years of practice, I've never had him on my couch. And that's kind of like not experience it. In general, for men, there's an acceptance of a man sexually is an acceptance of him in his personhood. And that, that to be sexually accepted feels affirmed and received and accepted. And the flip side of that, to feel rejected, that feels like a broad rejection of who I am as a man. That whereas I've had a lot of women kind of express feeling just like a sexual object to their husband, and a piece where my husband doesn't really care about who I am as a person. He's just interested in my body and just interested in sex in a way that feels very discouraging and undermining and demeaning and anti-relational, and definitely not a turn on kind of for them. And and that's just a reality of how we experience some things differently.
Mm.
Whereas, a lot of times men can make that situation even worse because they're thinking through how they receive sexual affirmation and how that feels like a broad general acceptance and affirmation. That husband can, out of seeing his wife through the lens of his own experience, think, I'll make this better by affirming how attractive she is in
Right.
pursuing her harder sexually.
Doing
And
unto her what he wants done to him.
right, right. And imagine that she's different than him, and that kind of backfires a little bit. You've seen that too.
Yes. Oh man. And I think of being able to miss the desire that's behind,
Mm,
for a wife to sit on the couch and say, man, I want to connect with you. I want to know how you feel about things. I want to know what's happening in your heart, and that there's so much desire there. And that can be, that can feel very overwhelming and that can be a husband or a wife, but it can feel overwhelming of like, will it ever be enough emotional connection? And in the same way, it can be missed that the spouse who's desiring more sexual connection, that's coming from such goodness inside of them, desire to be relationally close. But how that can be, like, the attribution that can be assigned to that is, oh, all they want is sex, and they don't want anything else. And how sad for the husband that's like, oh man, that didn't do what I was hoping it would do.
that didn't quite land.
Right. Exactly. And then how discouraging it is, and how, and then there tends to be silence and distance around the subject, which then creates, that gap creates even more room for there to be hurt. And
Resentment and bitterness and kind of that underlying tension in the relationship.
yes, exactly. And so, yeah.
Tish, I'm a man, and I'm maybe typical in some ways, and that I can be real task oriented, and I like a to-do list, and I like to put on my tool belt and know how I can fix it and make it better. So I empathize with this guy and his question some in terms of like, so how do I fix it? I got my tool belt. Like, how do I fix the situation? How do I make it better? I want a punch list of to-dos, what I can do to kind of navigate this. Sometimes trying to figure out my wife, kind of feels like I'm blindfolded and been spun around and I'm throwing a dart at a moving target. It's like, how am I going to make this work? So can you maybe kind of create a punch list here
Yeah.
of, if this guy's thinking about what can I do practically
Right.
in order to try to help cultivate a richer, healthy sexual dynamic and relationship that invites my wife into a connection with me and a relationship where we have a frequency that feels good to me in a relationship. What are some practical things that this
Yeah.
guy can do?
Where to start is to, um, invest in, I would say, two things. One, have open dialogue, of how are you feeling about our sexual life, kind of where are you at, and beginning just to have, I mean, a
And you're
couple
talking about inviting her into that dialogue, right?
fighting.
Not kind of like telling him, hey, I'd like to be having more sex, and you're kind of failing as a wife because you're not putting out like I would like for you to. That's not what you mean, right?
Right. And so coming to the conversation with a lot of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
that your goal is to be building an internal mental map of kind of where your wife is, how she's conceptualizing sexuality, how she's experiencing it, what she's wanting in the relationship. And so inviting her to kind of share, what's going on inside of her around sexuality.
Okay, so I'm making notes here, right? So step one, maybe close my mouth and
Okay.
that and open my ears,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yes.
and listen and maybe invite an honest conversation and for my wife to be able to share with me how she experiences our sexual relationship
Yes.
and not interrupt and not kind of tell her how she should be experiencing it, then, but instead create a safe space for her to actually share what it's like for her and how she experiences it on her end.
Yes.
So
And yes, Josh. And this is hard, right? Because in that space, remember 100% of couples have differing desires. So being in that space, it being safe means us being able to hold my experience is valid and my spouse's experience is valid, even though they're going to be very different. And so of being able to hear what your wife is saying and really like see it as valid and try to stay present with that. And it's a little bit like if you wanted to get from where you are to somewhere else, you have to know where you're starting, right? You have to,
totally.
Google Maps has to be able to pick up your current location for you to even begin.
Right. How are we going to find where we're getting to if we don't know where we're starting at or where we're beginning at? And I just, sometimes we get the question of, Josh, how do I know when or if we need to get in counseling? Right. So, does everybody need to be in counseling? How do I know if I need to be in counseling? How do I know if our situation needs to be in counseling or whatnot? Let me just throw this out there for you guys. If you can't have this conversation that we're talking about here, like for whatever reason, it breaks down, it doesn't work, you can't and or when she starts to share kind of her experience, it's triggering to you in a way that you become defensive and you interrupt and you get escalated and you can't have this conversation. That's a deadpan indicator that you need to get into counseling. And that for whatever reason, you're not able to have the kind of conversation that you need to be able to have in order to be able to navigate through these things. And so it's just saying, hey, step one is have this kind of dialogue. Well, if you can't do step one, because we're not able to talk through things at that level, we're not able to hold space for our spouse's experience that's different than ours, if we're not able to maintain that safety, then you've got to get that addressed and figure out what's getting in the way there before you can even take step one kind of in this department.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so that would be step one, right?
Yeah. Step one.
What would be another, if I'm taking notes here?
Yes. So I want to go away. If I'm a man, I want to go away from that conversation to knowing what is my wife relationally longing for.
Hmm.
I want to make it my
I
mission.
mean, in the bedroom, like what kind of positions or what kind
If,
of
if
is
your
that?
wife, if that is what your wife shares, cool. Chances are it won't be.
No, no. Okay, so what should I be listening for? Because I'm having a conversation about sex, and so I'm thinking sex, right? I'm a guy thinking that what she's going to share with me is going to be about what happens like in the bedroom and techniques, something I need to be doing different, maybe read a book on. But what I heard you say was that be prepared for the things that maybe she shares to actually be related more to things outside the bedroom.
Yes. And so, of thinking of sexuality is one aspect of how we experience the relational bond in our relationship. So, when you bring up sex, your wife is probably going to bring up how she's experiencing her own relational needs and what
Mm.
she desires. So, you're still talking about relational needs. It's just that you're experiencing relational need in sexuality and you being curious about your wife's sexual feelings and kind of her thoughts is automatically going to bump in to how she's experiencing her relational longings of what she feels like is going well, what feels like is not working. And so I would
So
say,
they're connected. in that. I know we've said it 3 times. So those guys sometimes have trouble kind of absorbing these things. And so it's worth underscoring again, because a lot of times guys can feel confused by this, right? Like we think we're trying to have a conversation about this. My wife is talking about this. Like, doesn't she know the question I ask? Like, I'm so confused here. Like, why are we talking about this when I was asking about this? Like we're lost in the wilderness. We're wandering around. Why can we not just talk about what I'm trying to talk about? I'm so confused here.
Yes.
But they're related, is what you're saying.
Relating, going back to women, to say it simply, women need oxytocin in their body to desire sex. And so so the question you're answering is, what are the ways that I can flood my wife's body with oxytocin?
Yes.
And so that is very much connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
Her heart. There's a lot of factors. Is she tired? Is she fatigued? Is she feeling, just like she has nothing left, like no resources left? And so a lot of times men ask their wives questions about that. And sometimes wives might make mention of, I just feel so tired. And for men to hear that as valid, that
Totally, because men don't understand that. A lot of times most men, can be in a coma. They can be dead to the world, and their wife can be like, I'm kind of horny, and new life has sprung into their body. They're like, I'm awake. I can rise to the occasion. I'm here, ready to do my duty. I'm good to go. But female bodies aren't like that. Like, that's not the way they're wired. It's not the way they're made. Fatigue, neurologically, physiologically, is a huge inhibitor to arousal to a female body. And sometimes men can think that's a cop-out, right? Because we don't experience our sexuality in the same way. Can be like, I'm tired sometimes. I can still kind of get after it. But the reality of a woman's body not physiologically arousing, mean that she's not going to enjoy the experience, which means she's not going to desire the experience. That's a real thing. That's a reality of how female bodies are different than male bodies. Am I making that up?
No, that is so real. And it isn't a sense of she's choosing to not desire sex. It's like literally, physiologically, fatigue blocks sexual arousal in a female body. And so of being able to listen for those kinds of things, and that is investing in these different areas of life. Okay, like, let's look at, man, I want to, and it's a way to show your wife incredible value too, right? Of like, oh, you're able to hear her, of like, she feels exhausted, like, okay, well, what does that look like to help you?
And you're saying that's a turn on.
It's very attractive.
That creates an oxytocin response, that when Josh kind of values you and expresses that, Josh, your husband, kind of notices you and expresses those things.
Right. And then there's such a sense of him lending his strength to me, of like, oh, okay, well, I want to help with this. Like, what do we need to do? One of the sexiest things my husband ever did was hire a cleaning company to come clean my house.
How amazing was that, right?
Right. And so it was, but like, my heart felt very seen. I felt very visible to him. I felt like what I was struggling with mattered to him. He was coming alongside me and lending his strength and supporting me. And whether that's in problem solving, whether that's in looking at the family calendar, we're talking about this specific area of fatigue, but is communicating so much care.
Yeah. And I want to, if, for the men that are out there that are listening to this, there's some confusion that's maybe kind of coming up, because they're like, well, what about the more like erotic kinds of connecting, right?
Yeah.
Like, what about, how does that come into play? Does that mean that that's not of interest to my wife at all? Is that, because it seems like it is. Is she like pretending when certain kinds of physical things that we engage, are a turn on or accelerator? Like, where does that fit in this? Because I'm hearing about all these things kind of outside the bedroom, but where does this fit in there? And I maybe want to use a fire analogy, right? You've been out there, if you ever built fires. I did a lot of scouting and camping as a young man. And so we learned firecraft and how to build fires, right? And we learned there's different kinds of wood or fuel for a fire, right? And there's like 3 different kind of sizes of fuel that you'll use to build a fire. And the largest is this fuel kind of log, right? And if I take and I light a match and I stick it under a big old log, I am not going to start a fire. Like, it's not going to work. The match is going to burn down in my fingers. I'm going to burn my fingers, and the log's not going to catch on fire, right? It's not going to work. Not because it couldn't catch on fire, not because it's not something defective about the firewood, and the firewood would be fine. It just doesn't work. It needs some other things in order to be able to stoke the fire to a place where it can consume that kind of fuel, right? So you need kindling and tinder, which I think is ironic, right? That the beginning place for building a fire starts with tinder. That that's the finest kind of level of fire starting that you use, and you take shavings of sticks or small twigs, or twine that's kind of been fluffed up into a ball, and you can take a match to it and it lights. And then you can add a little bit larger kindling, and as that grows, then you can add kind of fuel to that fire. And female sexuality is not all that much different than that. For one, it really does start with tenderness.
Yeah.
Like maybe in new relationships where it's real dopamine and adrenaline driven, and guys can be real confused by this because, man, when we were dating or we were early in our relationship, we were just both hot for each other, and we could just kind of like go right after and pursue that in a real direct way, and that was a turn on for her. In that real adrenaline, dopamine driven place in a relationship, it's maybe like kerosene soaked logs, right? And that have this accelerant of adrenaline and dopamine. And so you light a match and touch that, and it bursts into flames, right? And so we get into marriage and we're like, okay, we light that match and throw it on the log, and nothing. It doesn't burst into flames.
Yes.
What's happening here? And realize that it really does start with tenderness. And then these things that we're talking about that are outside of the bedroom, we're kind of laying these twigs, we're laying these smaller branches on there, which then sets the foundation, gives us some coals, gives us this oxytocin kind of presence within the body, that then when the more direct erotic kinds of sexuality and engagement are laid onto the fire, they take and they burn, and it's ablaze. Does that make sense as I describe that from maybe using a masculine or male kind of word picture to your experience as a woman and your experience with your clients?
Yeah, I think I love the tenderness to be what a fire starts with. And I think for the actual like practicality, let's say you've done it, you've had the conversation, you've invested in relationship, you've hired a cleaning company to come in, your wife feels rested, right? And you're in the actual space, and of being able to have a sense of even of a non-direct approach actually in the moment. And so, for example, you would...
we're taking notes here, because now we're getting to the good stuff, right? And what where the question began, it just didn't know it didn't, this was like step 5, not step 1, right? Because we're talking at this point, we're talking in the bedroom, and
In
we're
the
talking about as we're engaging and
Yes.
how female sexuality is different than male, and what's kind of, okay, so now we're oriented, all the men are oriented out there as to where we're at.
Yes, yes. And something that I want to even say is for women to be aware of how your sexuality works, and that a lot of times physical arousal comes before desire. And so your spouse reaches out to you and says, hey, are you, whatever that, are you up for a connection time? Or would you be interested in sex tonight? And, you're like, oh, I haven't, like, that has not been on my radar at all. My mind is on 10,000 other things. And to be able to, for both to be able to come to that space and say, okay, well, what if we looked in each other's eyes? We cuddled, we kissed, and we started indirectly and just allowed there to be a lot of space for tenderness. Then that creates that is the right kind of environment to kindle a fire. And so, practically what this looks like, if you think of the body as having nerve endings, and that's what creates, good feelings when we're touched, then there's parts of the body that have more nerve endings than others. And so when we're talking about a non-direct approach, I literally mean starting with parts of the body that don't have such concentrated nerve endings. So these would be the places like the shoulders, the arms, the hands. Then there's maybe like a second level, right? And these would be the places that are not common to touch other people that isn't your spouse. Maybe the stomach, the neck, the back of the legs. And then the final tier would be the erogenous zones that you would kind of think of that would be a part of a sexual experience together. And so for when you're trying to create space that is inviting your wife to come connect with you, and inviting her to be able to kind of lean into pleasure, experiencing her own pleasure, sharing that with you, that is the way to start. Not having pressure that it has to end any certain way, right? That if she does show up and she's like, sure, let's kiss. It's like, oh man, can I have a rain check for tomorrow night? Or can we, this was so nice, but I really do just feel so tired and my body is just not getting there. That whenever you're able to respond to that and say, oh, honey, I completely understand. Like, let me just cuddle you. And as a husband, you can kind of file that away as like, I just made a powerful investment into my relationship and into my wife experiencing my care. And that goes a long way the next time you're in that space.
Totally, can bank those, right?
Yes, that isn't wasted time, right? Any connection time is, huge investment,
Right.
deposits into your relational rapport and bond and connection.